Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Dangerous Instrument, Political Polarization and U.S. Civil-Military Relations by Michael A. Robinson, narrated by Adam Barr. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and tables present in the print and e-book formats of the book. The Army is a dangerous instrument to play with. George Washington, A Letter to Alexander Hamilton, April 4th, 1783. 1. Introduction. How do you politicize a military? At a glance, the answer in the American case may be just as Ernest Hemingway suggested one goes bankrupt. Gradually, then suddenly. Indeed, both long unfolding and recent trends are evident in the precarious future of American democratic traditions, reflecting a general loss of trust in their governing institutions. At the top, low confidence in bureaucratic and federal agencies has crystallized as partisan identity increasingly shapes perceptions of government performance. Among the public, cultural animosity and interpersonal tribalism have sharpened as that same partisanship alienates individuals from each other. The state of hyperpolarization that has invaded nearly every aspect of American political life has brought with it the threat of politicizing institutions that have traditionally remained outside the skirmishes of partisan politics. Even casual observers of politics are likely aware of the problem posed by such politicization. The maintenance of fair law enforcement establishments, independent court systems, and credible scientific communities, to name a few, relies on an institutional credibility that sets them apart from mere secondary partisan battlefields. The focus of this book concerns the struggle for non-partisanship among America's most favored institution, the military. This analysis of partisan polarization and the civil-military relationship comes at a critical juncture, as concerns over the erosion of democratic institutions and advancing authoritarianism worldwide have ignited debate over the future of American governance. Some of the most popular books of the day bear names like How Democracies Die, How Civil Wars Start, and Twilight of Democracy. While the United States has experienced a noticeable decline across numerous metrics of democratic quality adopted by political scientists. Surveys of the American public reveal sharp divides over matters of objective fact, the growing influence of mis- and disinformation sources, and a creeping normalization of political violence in line with partisan identity. Amidst this backdrop is the American military, both a reliable bastion of public esteem and one increasingly immersed in unprecedented partisan political waters. The modern relationship between the American public and its military is complicated. In the span of 50 years, the military has gone from its nadir of public confidence following the Vietnam War to a seemingly untouchable post-9/11 level of prestige. But this reversal of fortune for the military's image has occurred alongside a shrinking understanding amongst the public of the military and veterans. Citizens consistently register high confidence in the military institution despite organizational mismanagement, ethical scandals, and 2 decades of frustrated stalemates abroad. This same confidence, it should be noted, far outstrips the public's impression of the representative institutions in government that characterize American democracy. A cursory glance at such patterns might lead one to suspect that the military enjoys an unassailable insulation from politicization amidst rising partisan polarization. In short, that despite the tangible effects of politicizing behavior on public regard for the courts, mass media, or law enforcement, the armed forces possess some ineffable quality. One of the central contentions of this book is that this assumption is deeply flawed. While not the specific focus of this study, the nature of public confidence in the military is an important pattern in understanding the dynamics of military politicization today. Many scholars and policymakers have steadily observed these trends at the surface level, seeing high public confidence in the military as evidence of strong civil-military relations, or even as an example for other institutions to follow. But these patterns, subjects of increasing concern in civil-military affairs, aren't happening in a vacuum. The political environment in which they exist reflects different normative sensibilities, media environments, and governing philosophies than those that existed in the foundational years of civil-military theory. Perhaps more troublingly, an increasing deference to the military amongst many Americans has run concurrently with spiking dissatisfaction with democratic governance, acute partisan polarization, and growing acceptance of illiberal political norms. As developed democracies in many areas of the world struggle to hold back a tide of anti-democratic political activity, the United States continues to imbue most of its trust in its least democratic institution. When observed against such a backdrop, Americans' relationship to the military has far different implications. Despite long-held norms against their inclusion in partisan politics, military figures are more present in that sphere than at any time in modern history, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Retired military officers have crossed into this arena as regular political appointees, popular policy commentators, and outright partisan rabble-rousers. Even active duty service members have found themselves drawn into partisan fights, not only as instruments of policy, but totems of institutional credibility. As polarization degrades the traditional firewall that has kept professional institutions like the military out of partisan politics, the result is an environment ripe for politicization. The purpose of this book is to gain new insights into the state of civil-military relations, in a time where partisan polarization, selective media exposure, democratic backsliding, and military politicization have taken on new proportions and higher stakes. The seemingly positive pattern of confidence in the military institution over time may instead mask a more negative trend of political tribalism and illiberal norms, with potentially deleterious effects to American democracy. What do we mean by politicization, and what are the ways in which this idea can manifest? With whom does the military have credibility, and why? What are the limits of that credibility, and how does this reflect the depths of polarization? What are the implications of such deference to the armed forces on the future of democratic governance? Using data-driven analysis of experimental and observational information about the American public, this book offers a humble contribution to answering each of these questions, concluding with recommendations for policymakers and national security professionals on how best to curtail the negative effects of politicization on civil-military affairs. A persistent dilemma. In the tradition of developed democracies, the structural arrangements that govern how civilian leaders interact with their militaries all seek to address a common dilemma: how to house a martial institution like the armed forces within a liberal democracy without either failing at their respective functions. The mandate of the military, to fight and win wars, and its important possession of the means of force within the state, requires a civil-military architecture capable of reconciling its existence with a free society that places a premium on non-violent conflict resolution. This challenge, which civil-military scholar Peter Fever refers to as the civil-military problématique, has elicited a variety of theoretical solutions and prescriptions over time. How can the military perform its own role as institutional security guarantor without threatening the larger framework of liberal democratic governance? Many civil-military frameworks have been strongly influenced by the prescriptions of political scientist Samuel Huntington in his 1957 treatise, The Soldier and the State, in which he outlined two architectural plans for civil-military coexistence, the most favored being the concept of objective civilian control. This arrangement, devised on a division of labor between civilians and the military, envisions both in respective spheres of responsibility. The former articulates broad strategic goals and political objectives, while the latter tends to the execution of policy on the battlefield. The American military's own organizational ethic seemingly reflects the aspirations of objective control, and Huntington's assertion that civilian leaders can maintain both liberal political values and a competent military establishment by compartmentalizing the latter into a profession that is politically sterile and neutral. Despite its many anachronisms and lack of fit within the modern national security environment, even this basic arrangement requires a credible military institution composed of reliable experts in the training and implementation of the force. Therefore, a cornerstone of this classical civil military theory is a prohibition against partisan activity by the military, a tradition that successive scholars would deem essential to the maintenance of a stable solution to the problématique. This school of thought obliges the removal of the military from the partisan political sphere in order to satisfy both a functional imperative for the armed forces to win wars, as well as a societal imperative to prevent threats to liberal governance. This is not only a normative measure, but a pragmatic policy, ensuring both a stable democratic regime and a unified command structure effective in wartime. As a result, institutionalized control of the military by civilian political leaders is commonly seen as a mainstay requirement of true democratic governance. This concept of objective control has informed the study of civil-military relations for decades, and has strongly influenced the American military's professional education and organizational ethos. This does not mean, as we will observe, that objective control's purest vision for civil-military relations is either sound or realistic. For example, this theoretical firewall between the military and politics not only applied to overt displays of partisan affiliation, but to any involvement in the political roots of policy more broadly. Many scholars, such as Risa Brooks, have since expressed skepticism at this extreme interpretation of the apolitical norm as a hyper-aversion to politics that could prevent military officers from performing their job effectively. Elliot Cohen similarly argues that military and political leaders operate in a common, if unequal, dialogue regarding security affairs given civilian control of the process. As such, political elites are better served by involving themselves directly in the military sphere, rather than outsourcing its management to military elites. Despite its influence, it is objective control's blindness to the actual intersections of partisan politics and military affairs that demands additional scrutiny. In this sense, it is soldier and the state's own, if ill-favored, inverse concept of subjective control that may prove more important in understanding military politicization today. While the separate spheres approach of objective control sought to solve the problématique through professionalization and independence of activity, subjective control captured efforts to directly influence the normative values of the military itself. Civil military scholars such as Morris Janowitz offered a similar observation that military and civilian responsibilities in security decision-making are not so easily subjected to a clean division of labor, and that the American political system is in fact designed to accommodate a military voice in policymaking. Instead, this convergence idea assumes that it is inevitable that the military will come to resemble a political pressure group, such that the only meaningful insurance for the preservation of liberal values and civilian control is for the larger society to more directly shape the character of the military institution. Recent American and comparative political trends have even encouraged some scholars to re-examine the utility of subjective control's application in the U.S. case. While the institutionalized guardrails of objective control are depicted as protections against a politicized military, the integrative tenets of subjective control and similar sociological approaches to civil-military relations take such politicization as table stakes. In this school of thought, the military is inevitably entwined with partisan politics. The best that liberal-minded civilian politicians can do is bring the military into line with civilian political values. Understanding these different accounts of the military's relationship with both civilian leaders and the mass public is even more significant today, given the contemporary challenges faced by democratic governments. The classical theorists have informed much of our understanding of civil-military relations, particularly in the American context, offering seemingly contradictory accounts of the most favorable methods by which the civilian political elite can constrain the military in society. The key thread that connects them is a common concern regarding a military institution captured by specific partisan interests, such that it cannot be trusted to live peaceably alongside a democratic society. If objective control more cleanly separates the military from politics, it may prove naive to the actual nexus between them. Similarly, if subjective control accepts some baseline politicization of the military as given, its prescription to have civilian leaders shape the institution's character may assume too much about those same civilians' political incentives. In either case, the conflation of the military and partisan political institutions not only poses a potential challenge to the functionality of the armed forces, but to the stability of democratic governance more broadly. These frameworks will inform much of the subsequent analysis of this work, as we assess the causes and consequences of politicization and how these classical ideas can help us make sense of them. While models of civil-military architecture vary, the proscription against political activity by the military has been a centerpiece of professional education and organizational ethics for the modern officer corps. One of the principal contributions of this book will be to examine how recent political trends have affected the extent to which this norm persists, and the different ways in which politicization of the military can manifest. The twin patterns of high public trust in the military and deepening partisan polarization amongst that same public have resulted in an environment where politicization of institutions like the military is more likely. A politicized institution, as defined by Alice Hunt Friend, exercises loyalty to a single political party and/or consistently advocates for and defends partisan political positions and fortunes. Heidi Urban discusses the challenge of politicization as a function of political activity by the institution or its representatives, namely, whether the armed forces are too partisan in composition, too vocal in speech, or too resistant to civilian control. These are helpful foundations for understanding this idea of politicization. By these categorizations, both existing civil-military relations thought and the more intuitive requirements of democracy demand that the military not only avoid being politicized by partisan organizations, but refrain from politicizing itself. Indeed, this conceptualization of politicizing behavior is essential to the succeeding chapter's analysis on its many manifestations. When individuals hear that an issue or institution is being politicized, the reflexive assumption is often that the item under dispute is being used for partisan political gain against some perceived normative prohibition or expectation. For example, when major events shake the public consciousness, any resulting discussion of the policy implications or sources of culpability may be seen as politicizing the issue, if the proposal redounds to the benefit of one party's political agenda over another. Politicized domains, therefore, are typically ones in which no bipartisan consensus exists, leaving room for repurposing issue areas, key individuals, or even whole institutions for the benefit of partisan political advantage. With regards to the military, traditional norms against its use as a partisan implement, or self-advancement as one, reflect the belief among many civil-military scholars that a non-partisan military is a public good, and to use it as a partisan instrument politicizes an otherwise objective institution. However, an important distinction will inform the use of politicization as a term in this book, in an effort to provide clearer criteria for its sources and consequences. As Jim Golby notes, political science offers an opportunity to provide such clarity as opposed to less precise or amorphous employment of the concept. Civilian leaders in charge of military activities nearly always represent some partisan interest, whether as appointees or as private citizens who harbor some political sensibilities closer to one party or the other. When it comes to the military, organizational oversight, administrative reform, and employment at home and abroad fall into the hands of these same individuals. In addition, the military may reform organizational practices or engage in decision-making that reflects a non-partisan desire to improve its own functionality in warfighting or administrative management. Are these politicizing acts? In both cases, politicization can still occur because of the distorting effects of partisanship amongst the public. One of the effects of polarization in American politics, as we will see, is the increasing number of issue domains over which there is no bipartisan consensus. The more partisan issues there are, the higher the probability that actions taken by any actor, whether military or civilian, intentional or incidental, will have a politicizing effect. This can occur from purposeful partisan behavior taken by civilian politicians or military officers, as well as actions taken in good faith by these same figures in accordance with the legal bounds of their respective offices. Therefore, this book envisions military politicization as any activity taken by military or civilian actors that not only moves the armed forces closer to advocacy of or opposition to a specific political party, but creates the perception that this is the case. This likely expands the universe of cases that have some politicizing effect on the military, from executive-level employment of the force to congressional activity to more overt examples of using the military for partisan gain. To be sure, the most noticeable instances of politicizing behavior often occur when key actors step outside their prescribed roles. Military leaders engaging in partisan advocacy or civilian leaders leveraging the military in legally dubious ways certainly fit this bill. But politicization, as we will uncover, can occur without intention and without any actors deviating from constitutionally envisioned roles. Politicization may therefore be just as much a function of observable effect as purposeful motive. It is this distinction that will inform our understanding of how high public confidence in the military and declining cross-partisan consensus both contribute to several categories of politicization. Chapter 2 will outline a basic typology of politicizing behaviors based on this definition, acknowledging the importance of three major players in civil-military relations: the public, the military itself, and the major political parties. From this constellation of bodies, and their relative position to one another in a perceived ideological space, we will identify four patterns of politicization from the perspective of the observing public. Active and passive politicization occur when the moving actor is the military. Specifically, when the military engages in behavior that either moves the institution closer to party capture or creates the impression of the same. Active politicization identifies when this happens due to the purposeful agency of the military itself, while passive politicization identifies when the behavior was ordered or contrived by civilian leaders instead. Of particular importance to these categories is an understanding of the military as a broad community that also includes retired service members, who, though no longer in uniform, represent the institution to the public. The last two categories address when political bodies reposition around the military, creating the illusion of movement. Relative politicization occurs when the parties themselves move along the ideological spectrum, leaving the public observer with the impression that the military is now closer or farther away from one party or another, despite a lack of tangible action. By contrast, aspect politicization occurs with the opposite, due to media consumption, responses to political rhetoric, or preference shifts. Individual observers themselves move along the ideological range, gaining a new, if often incorrect, perspective of the military's position. In total, this parallax model of politicization recognizes the importance of relative position for these bodies in the political space, the prospect of illusory movement, and the significance of perspective, all of which are likely shaped by partisan sensibilities. As this book will detail, these manifestations of politicization pose powerful challenges to the nonpartisan norm on which so much of civil military theory is based. To the scholarly thinkers reviewed here, keeping the military out of partisan political battles has manifest utility, preventing the institution from becoming an advocate for a single political platform or captured by a specific political party. Applied to the contemporary environment, this central normative claim fails to account for new political realities. Perhaps more pointedly, it relies on a critical, if potentially flawed, assumption that the public broadly embraces a nonpartisan military as a desirable and politically necessary fixture of government. Instead, this assumption's chief obstacle comes in the defining characteristic of the modern political landscape: partisan polarization. Polarization and the civil-military relationship. Partisan polarization significantly complicates the idealized image of civil-military relations that classical theorists offer. Some of the most important contributions of the succeeding chapters will be to reveal the damaging effects of political tribalism on preserving not only the politically sterile and neutral military that Huntington envisioned, but the maintenance of well-functioning democratic governance. Stripping the state's institution for the management of violence of its objectivity has manifestly dangerous implications, made more likely in an environment where the military is increasingly tugged into unfamiliar waters. To be sure, some of the most dire instances of military politicization outside the United States have resulted in its institutional capture by domestic partisan factions, or its weaponization as an oppressive apparatus. However, even short of the extreme scenarios of brutal state-directed repression or coup d'etat, a loss of military credibility can erode this traditional notion of civil-military relations in a variety of ways. Through the use of various survey instruments and observational data analysis techniques, this book will probe public attitudes about the military institution, particularly from the vantage offered through the public's partisan identity. From the way individuals consume media to their preconceptions about the armed forces, this effort will provide new insights into the nature of public confidence in its military. It will also attempt to offer recommendations in which military leaders and policymakers can address the challenges that polarization-driven military politicization poses to the civil-military relationship. First, this trend threatens to compromise the general credibility of the military institution. As indicated in this introduction, the prospect of a military seen as an extension of one political party could collapse public trust in the institution and hamstring its ability to perform its primary function, fighting and winning wars. Given the high level of public trust that the military enjoys with the public, hyperpartisanship makes using military voices for political gain more tempting and potentially lucrative. This can politicize the institution from without, by making the military a prop for partisan opportunism, and from within, by incentivizing partisan activity by representatives of the military institution. Second, polarization over the quality of the military institution threatens the continued ability of the military to perform its principal function as national security guarantor. A side effect of the tribalism just described is a tendency among specific partisans to view the military as an extension of their own domestic political identity, rather than merely an agent of government. Partisan political sensibilities can result in a reticence to criticize or interrogate military decision-making on the battlefield, even amidst failure and frustration, because of the fear of poor optics. As a result of the desire to insulate the military from criticism,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?